Welcome and thank you for joining the Federal Aviation Administration's, or FAA's, virtual public scoping meeting for the Environmental Impact Statement, or EIS, for the SpaceX Starship-Super Heavy launch vehicle at Launch Complex 39A at the Kennedy Space Center, Florida. On May 10, 2024, the FAA announced its intent to prepare an Environmental Impact Statement, or EIS, for the proposed SpaceX Starship-Super Heavy launch vehicle at Launch Complex 39A at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. This EIS will be prepared to comply with the National Environmental Policy Act, and the EIS includes a 45-day public scoping period. The FAA is also conducting consultations under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act for potential effects on historic properties. Section 106 allows the public to weigh in on project impacts on historic properties before a decision is made. The agenda for this presentation includes information on the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, the proposed action to include the location of the proposed action, previous NEPA analysis associated with this action, proposed infrastructure improvements, details on the Starship-Super Heavy launch vehicle, and proposed launches and landings. This presentation will also discuss alternatives considered, as well as the purpose and need for the proposed action. The role of the FAA and cooperating agencies will also be discussed. Finally, resource areas to be studied in the EIS will be discussed. Towards the end of the presentation, information will be provided regarding how to submit scoping comments within and outside of this virtual meeting. The National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, requires all federal agencies to consider the environmental impacts of their proposed actions prior to making decisions. The public is encouraged to participate in the NEPA process. The Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA, announced its intent to prepare an EIS on May 10, 2024, and is the lead agency. We are within the 45-day public comment period ending June 24, 2024. As you can see from the EIS process chart, we are early in the NEPA process. After the comment period ends, a draft EIS will be prepared. Your comments will be used to determine the resources and alternatives to be analyzed in the report. A notice will be published in the Federal Register and newspapers when the draft EIS is available to the public. Additional public meetings will then be held to obtain input on the analysis presented in the document. After a 45-day public comment period, a final EIS will be prepared. As part of the final EIS, we will respond to your comments and update the text as appropriate. The Record of Decision, or ROD, is the final stage in the EIS process. The FAA will issue a ROD that states the decision, any mitigation plans, monitoring requirements, and other items. The ROD completes the environmental review, but it does not guarantee the FAA will issue a license. All safety and other reviews must be completed before the FAA can make a license determination. LC-39A is a SpaceX leased launch site located on northern Kennedy Space Center property, approximately 3 miles east of NASA's Vehicle Assembly Building. LC-39A currently supports SpaceX Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy launches. SpaceX proposes to construct launch, landing, and other associated infrastructure at and in proximity to LC-39A to support Starship-Super Heavy operations. In September 2019, NASA completed the final environmental assessment, or EA, for the SpaceX Starship and Super Heavy launch vehicle at Kennedy Space Center to evaluate the potential environmental impacts resulting from construction and operations associated with use of LC-39A for the SpaceX Starship-Super Heavy launch vehicle. NASA issued a finding of no significant impact and SpaceX has undertaken infrastructure improvements at LC-39A, for example, construction of a launch mount. However, the Starship Super Heavy concept of operations has evolved from the original 2019 EA scope. SpaceX proposes to conduct up to 44 Starship and Super Heavy booster launches per year. Launches may occur during the day or at night. Each Starship Super Heavy orbital launch would include landing Super Heavy boosters at LC-39A, downrange in the Atlantic Ocean, or on a drone ship. SpaceX could also expend the booster in the Atlantic Ocean, no closer than 5 nautical miles off the coast. SpaceX would land Starship at LC-39A or on a drone ship. SpaceX could also expend Starship in the open ocean between 55 degrees south latitude and 55 degrees north latitude. SpaceX has constructed some infrastructure at LC-39A to support Starship Super Heavy operations. SpaceX proposes to construct additional infrastructure improvements at LC-39A to support the Starship Super Heavy. Additional infrastructure improvements to be addressed in the EIS include, but are not limited to, Super Heavy Catch Tower, on-site facilities for propellant generation and propellant storage, for example, natural gas pretreatment system and methane liquefier, cooling tower, air separation unit, deluge system. Starship Super Heavy is comprised of 2 stages. Super Heavy is the first stage, or booster, and Starship is the second stage. As designed, both stages are reusable, with any potential refurbishment actions taking place at SpaceX facilities located at NASA's Kennedy Space Center. Both stages are expected to have minimal post-flight refurbishment requirements. However, they may require periodic maintenance and upgrades. Pre-launch activities include testing to ensure that vehicle and ground systems are functioning properly. SpaceX proposed operations include launching Starship Super Heavy from LC-39A and landings and/or recovery. SpaceX proposes to launch Starship Super Heavy up to 44 times per year, with launches occurring anytime during the day or night. Landing of Super Heavy may occur at LC-39A or downrange in the Atlantic Ocean on a drone ship, which is defined as a mobile vessel not attached to the sea floor. SpaceX could also expend Super Heavy in the Atlantic Ocean no closer than 5 nautical miles off the coast, which would result in the scuttling of the booster. Starship could land at LC-39A or on a drone ship in the Pacific, Atlantic, or Indian Ocean. SpaceX would then be able to reuse Starship for other missions. The Council on Environmental Quality defines reasonable alternatives as those that are technically and economically feasible and meet the purpose and need for the proposed action. The 2019 EA established LC-39A as the approved location for Starship Super Heavy operations, and infrastructure development, as described and analyzed in the 2019 EA, is already underway. Given the above, the only alternative to the proposed action that is proposed to be analyzed in detail in this EIS is the no-action alternative. Under the no-action alternative, FAA would not issue a vehicle operator license for Starship Super Heavy operations at LC-39A. SpaceX would not implement further improvements or launch Starship Super Heavy from LC-39A. Potential impacts associated with the no-action alternative will be analyzed in the EIS. In the 2019 environmental assessment, the purpose and need for Starship Super Heavy at Kennedy Space Center, LC-39A, was to develop and implement formal agreements with SpaceX for use of NASA assets and to provide services and commodities to enable Starship Super Heavy launches. Commercial use of Kennedy Space Center real property supports NASA's mandate to encourage the fullest commercial use of space, supports the goals of the National Aeronautics and Space Act, and advances the national space policy that federal agencies shall ensure that the United States government's space technology and infrastructure are made available for commercial use on a reimbursable, non-interference, and equitable basis. The need for Starship-Super Heavy at Kennedy Space Center aligns with NASA's Commercial Space Launch Act, as amended, which is to support the U.S. goal of encouraging activities by the private sector to strengthen and expand U.S. space transportation infrastructure. Issuance of a license or permit, including renewals and modifications, by the FAA is considered a major federal action under NEPA. Thus, FAA is analyzing the environmental impacts of the proposed issuance of a commercial launch vehicle operator license for SpaceX Starship-Super Heavy at LC-39A at Kennedy Space Center, as well as temporary closure of associated airspace in an EIS. FAA's license determination process includes several aspects, which includes a policy, location, safety, and environmental reviews. This EIS would fulfill the environmental review portion of the license evaluation and determination. Successful completion of the environmental review does not guarantee that the FAA will issue a license. This graphic provides a flowchart of the various aspects of the licensing process from initial discussions with FAA, acceptance of a vehicle operator's application, and the determination process. Once issued, a launch vehicle operator license can be valid for a period of up to 5 years, after which it must be renewed. This EIS has several cooperating agencies that have special expertise that FAA will use in the preparation of the EIS. Cooperating agencies include National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, United States Coast Guard, Department of the Air Force, United States Fish and Wildlife Service, and National Park Service. NASA owns and operates Kennedy Space Center, with jurisdiction by law over activities, including rocket launch activities, proposed to occur at Kennedy Space Center. NASA also has special expertise concerning environmental impacts associated with rocket launch operations. The Coast Guard has jurisdictional authority over safety and security matters in the maritime domain and responsibility to provide offshore support, including search and rescue response actions and safety, and security zone notifications during launch and recovery operations. The Department of the Air Force and the United States Space Force, SLD-45, at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, Florida, have relevant expertise in space-related operations in the Eastern Range. Additionally, the adjacent property directly south of KSCL C39A is managed by SLD-45. The Air Force and SLD-45 will participate in the review and evaluation of the proposal with regard to airspace, range use, and other potential cumulative impacts of the proposed action. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service manages the Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge and will review and evaluate impacts considering its primary responsibility for conservation and management of fish, wildlife, plants, and associated habitats. The National Park Service manages the Cape Canaveral National Seashore and will review impacts to the seashore and affected historic properties. Analysis of potential impacts associated with the proposed action is in the preliminary stages at this time, and the extent of effects to the human and natural environment have not yet been determined. The potential environmental impacts of all proposed construction and operational activities, including those from launch and landing, will be analyzed in the EIS. Resources to be analyzed include air quality, biological resources, including fish, wildlife, and plants, climate, coastal resources, Department of Transportation Act, Section 4F, properties, which are significant publicly owned parks, recreation areas, and wildlife or waterfowl refuges, or any publicly or privately owned historic site listed or eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. Farmlands, hazardous materials, solid and hazardous waste, and pollution prevention. Historical, architectural, archaeological, and cultural resources. Land use, natural resources and energy supplies. Noise and noise-compatible land use. Socioeconomics, environmental justice, and children's health and safety risks. Visual effects. Water resources, including wetlands, floodplains, surface waters, groundwater, and wild and scenic rivers. Cumulative impacts. The FAA is initiating consultation with the following agencies per associated regulatory requirements: the United States Fish and Wildlife Service under Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act and the Migratory Bird Treaty Act for potential impacts to protected species and habitats. The National Marine Fisheries Service under Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act for impacts to essential fish habitat and protected species. And the Florida Historic Preservation Office under the National Historic Preservation Act, Section 106, for impacts to historic and tribal resources. The public can submit comments on the Section 106 analysis during this NEPA scoping period and the comment period after the release of the draft EIS. Potential impacts associated with noise from launch and landing activities on the human and natural environment will be analyzed in the EIS. Noise is considered unwanted, extraneous, or annoying sound that interferes with or disrupts normal human activities. The response of different individuals to similar noise events is influenced by the type of noise, perceived importance of the noise, its appropriateness in the setting, time of day, type of activity during which the noise occurs, and sensitivity of the individual. The perception and evaluation of sound involves three basic physical characteristics: duration, the length of time the sound can be detected; magnitude, the acoustic energy, which is expressed in terms of sound pressure in decibels; frequency, the number of cycles per second the air vibrates in hertz. The graphic on the slide shows the sound level of common sounds, ranging from just barely audible, like a quiet recording studio, to the uncomfortable sound levels generated by a nightclub or oxygen torch. Noise analysis with the EIS will consider human annoyance, damage to structures from vibration and sonic booms, effects to land use compatibility, and hearing conservation. Noise impacts to biological resources will also be analyzed. That concludes our presentation session of today's meeting. We appreciate the chance to share the proposed action and the NEPA scoping and Section 106 consultation processes with you. We invite you to submit comments on specific resources and issues you would like to see addressed in the EIS and Section 106 consultation process.